to meet our students where they are, consider the social emotional learning aspect, provide time in each of your sessions to connect with students, and humor and grace go a long way. So I want to read you the tweet, and I'm quite active on Twitter, and I've seen quite a few tweets coming through. Can you go back, please, Lori? Thank you. I was still on that slide. Oh, perfect. Thank you. So this was from an educator, and she said, "Forget remote learning. I'm doing extreme remote loving right now. Kid I've been trying to contact for weeks, finally connected tonight. He's the third one in my class who's lost a primary person to COVID-19. Love to everyone, grace to all." And so if we consider this particular tweet and this particular educator, there's no way that we can engage in higher order thinking and critical thinking right now. We have to put those basic health and wellness needs before moving into the critical and higher order thinking. I think it's of note is that, you know, we've all abruptly moved from brick and mortar classrooms to learning from home, with home being very different for each of us as educators and as for our learners as well. So the social emotional aspect becomes even more significant. And so as you are teaching online, as our candidates are teaching online, we have to really ask ourselves a few questions. How have relationships changed between the classroom, school, family, and community at large? Are we still engaging with our families and communities? Are we giving students time and supports as they manage their emotions and their assets and needs? Let's not forget those assets. Do we provide opportunities for relationship building in our online and virtual environments? It's significant to begin each class in this online pandemic environment with warm, positive climates. So, you know, let students know that you're glad that they are there. Welcome them. Don't jump into instruction right away. Hopefully that's something that as educators we do in the classroom. We provide that opportunity to welcome and engage students to our class, and we want to take those same skill sets to an online environment. Thank your students for being present. Tell a joke, it releases endorphins. I'm a terrible joke teller, but I will tell my candidates jokes because it gets them laughing, it gets them engaged, it relaxes them. Offer grace. I'm seeing grace all over Twitter in regards to grades, in regards to extensions. Give those redos. Give those retakes. You know, ultimately this is about, I'm still on the same slide. I know, sorry. I have a lot of context. I'll let you know when I'm ready for the next slide though. Thank you. So make sure that you are giving grace. Offer the feedback, offer the supports. Really that's our role as educators, is that Maslow before Bloom's. Are we taking care of our emotional well-being for our students and for ourselves as well? It's important for us to recognize when we need those emotional supports as well. And to finish this particular slide, you know, the famous quote from Maya Angelou: "People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they won't forget how you made them feel." And this is especially true during this pandemic. Offering grace, offering warmth, offering a loving environment for our students to learn, whether it's our university students or our TK through 12 students. Next slide, please. So you can see I have another tweet here. I screenshotted a few tweets that, you know, caught my attention as I've been on Twitter in the last couple weeks since the pandemic started. But building rapport is essential, again, whether we are face-to-face or whether we are in this online environment. Ideally, our candidates and us as educators have had opportunities to build rapport in a face-to-face environment before this pandemic and we all went into emergency mode took place, but that wasn't necessarily the case for me. Cal State San Bernardino is on the quarter system, and we started this third quarter online. And so some of the students in my courses right now, I never had previously. And so I am working to build rapport through this online virtual teaching. I think it's important, again, to focus on that social emotional learning, continuing to build trust with the students and families. They're navigating this just like we are. So we do need to take the time out of all of our classes to build rapport, regardless of what grade level we're working with. Make learning fun. I know I said the F word, oh my gosh, the F word, fun, but make learning fun. And so this was this was a tweet. See, I make myself laugh and I release endorphins, friends. That's how this is done. So this was a tweet from an educator, Marion Dingle, and she said, "Today was Bring Your Animal to Zoom Day. Some brought live ones, some brought stuffed ones. So much joy seen in watching my students care for their animals. Just another glimpse into their daily lives. I am blessed." And so these are actually things that we can't necessarily do in a face-to-face environment. We can't have the whole class bring in their live pets, but we can now. One of the things that I did for my students, my candidates, the first week of the quarter is I had show and tell. And I gave them advance warning. I said, you know, we'll take 10 to 15 minutes and have show and tell. And I want each of you to tell us something. And I gave them some examples: favorite book you're reading, favorite spot in your home, favorite food that you've made thus far. I gave them a lot of opportunities and ideas, and they all brought something. Some of them shared that they were playing Animal Crossing, and then they connected with one another in that game. I'm not familiar. I don't play Animal Crossing, but I know it's a popular game. Some of them shared a book they read. Some of them talked about a fitness app they were using, but it helped to build rapport and lower that affective filter. And friends, if you have any ideas of how you are building rapport in your online environments, please feel free to put them in the chat. You know, I know we can all learn from one another. So my example again was show and tell, being able to relax, tell a joke. But if you have any strategies that have worked for you in this online environment, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'd love to read what you all are doing. We also need to model this rapport for our candidates and for our students. We need to model how to build these trusting environments in this online platform, because if we are asking our students to build rapport with one another, then we need to be modeling it. The Social, Emotional, and Cultural Anchor Competencies Framework, which was created by the Center for Reaching and Teaching the Whole Child, is a wonderful resource. I've used that extensively, whether it's face-to-face instruction or in an online environment. Building rapport does involve creating that safe and positive learning environment. So let's take a look at some of those examples from the virtual world. And I did see that someone posted in the chat, and so I'm curious what others are doing. Make content a game. Yep, points and groups. Awesome. This helps responses from the chats. Yeah, if we want buy-in from our students, again, there's that fun word, that F word. Norma says one of my interns plays educational games and quizzes. They make videos. And here's a joke. Okay, I'll read it. Why did Dwayne Johnson sleep under a newspaper? Because paper covers rock. Yes, and we know he is the rock. Awesome. I love it. I'll keep looking at those ideas that you all are sharing, because that's going to help build rapport. Next slide, please. So online protocols and modeling. We have to explicitly teach these skills just like we would in our face-to-face classroom. When we go back to the beginning of the school year, September, when school started, we model and we provide these protocols or norms. And so we need time for our TK through 12 or our candidates to figure out what all the buttons do. How do we raise the hand? How do we mute the microphone? When do we turn the camera off and on? How do we listen to our peers in this online environment? And that means muting the microphones, giving them opportunity to share, and then respond when appropriately. We also need to model group work. How do we work in this new space? I think a lot of our TK through 12 students are used to FaceTime. I think they don't even know how to make a normal phone call anymore. At least this is anecdotally from my own children. They call each other on FaceTime and then just put the phone down and talk to one another. But yet they also walk around the house with FaceTime on. And so I think in that aspect, they're sometimes used to having the camera on. We do need to model how to respect classmates. And again, I have model, model, model. And again, to provide humor, I do watch SNL every Saturday. It's kind of my one TV show that I watch. My husband and I watch it together. And 2 weeks ago, naturally, with all of us moving to Zoom, SNL did a skit about Zoom. And I took a little screenshot of that. And you can see poor Nan here in the right-hand corner was just having a terrible time on Zoom. And one of the other characters in this skit took her computer into the restroom. Obviously, that's not something we don't all go to the restroom together when we're face to face. So this is another protocol that needs to be modeled for our students. Put the camera down when you leave the room. You need to get a drink of water, use the restroom, etc. Don't take us with you into that space. And so there was some levity that was offered in that skit because it's things that we are all witnessing with our students as we've moved to online environments. Oh, this is great. Michelle Jones said, one of my candidates is having daily lunch hour with his students. I adore this. What a way to build rapport. Thank you for sharing that, Michelle. That's really a wonderful strategy. And then final slide, please, before I pass it over to Daniel. This last thing I wanted to discuss is really an equity piece, and it's referenced as video classism. And being able to turn your cameras on is very much a privilege. When we have traditionally taught face-to-face, we come to neutral territory, which is the classroom or the university. I wouldn't even necessarily say it's neutral. It sometimes favors us as educators because it's our world. But we come to neutral territory for the teacher and the learner. We've now moved into each other's homes. And I put quotes around home because home looks very different for each of us. Consider your learners that might be in group homes, foster care, an unsafe living condition. When they came to the brick and mortar classroom, these things were not necessarily obvious or evident to you as the educator or to their peers. But when they are obligated to turn their camera on in their quote unquote home, it now becomes an equity issue. And so I never require my candidates to turn the camera on. This is something that should be optional. It should never be a demand. I did read on Twitter a few weeks ago something that was rather upsetting to me. It was a TK through 12 educator that gave Class Dojo points for her students who turned the camera on. That's an equity issue. And so even as a professor, I don't have a home office. I've shared with some of my colleagues that I have to bounce around my house and I have to check what's behind my screen to make sure that it's appropriate. I do have, I hope, knock on wood, a wonderful relationship with all of my candidates. And I would hope that they would never, take screenshots and post those on Twitter and talk about what's in my background. But it's something to consider in regards to having a space. And so again, that option of having the camera off is paramount to the safety and well-being of our students. That's an SEL issue right there. It's an equity issue right there. And then your students might not have quiet spaces to learn. And so again, being able for them to mute if there's a lot of noise in their background. And I just want to reiterate that having a space to engage in online learning and instruction is a privilege, especially in this point right now where where our candidates, students maybe can't go to the library and participate in learning. They can't go to Starbucks. They are in their quote unquote home, again, whatever that looks like. And I'm going to check the chat. Glenn says, I model students being active online, fact check the lecture and look for more information about topics that you want to learn. Good, some different strategies. Norma, thank you. Excellent point that I'll pass on. Yes, you turning the camera on should never be mandatory for any of us. So with that, I will turn it over to Daniel, and I think I might have gone over my time limit. I hope not, but thank you all very much. And yeah, thank you for your points in the chat. Really quick, Rachel says, great point. It's been a frustration with our candidates trying to complete the TPA. Yeah, and so just really quick in regards to the TPA, you might have some students on with camera off, but as long as there's a few students in there with camera on that do have that option, then candidates can move forward with the TPA. And I won't go into too much TPA. I want to pass it to Daniel. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Karen. And before we pass the baton over to Daniel, just one point though, as Karen was indicating, it is a good idea if you can, because of privacy issues, to have camera off, that when teacher candidates are completing their TPA and shooting their video for the TPA, in order for that video to meet the video requirements, the teacher candidate and the students need to be seen in the video. So at least for that piece of time, it's a good idea for students, if they can, to have the cameras on so it can meet that video requirement. But during a normal teaching session, yes, that's always a good option to have in place. So thank you for sharing that, Karen. So Daniel, we'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, hi. So thanks, Wayne. Thanks, Karen. So I'm going to be talking about the section of the presentation that focuses on positive, equitable, and just virtual learning environments. Kind of like what Wayne was saying, most of it doesn't apply to the actual piece of evidence that candidates will be submitting into the CalTPA. I think that because that requires certain guidelines, like the videos beyond. So it's more of like the whole lesson or the whole learning segment, or just the whole teaching experience that our student teachers are having in the classroom. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, and how it can contribute to the TPA as well. So I'm going to talk about 3 different areas. The first area takes the culturally relevant, sustaining frameworks and the culturally complex backgrounds of your students into consideration when you plan your lessons. The second focuses on how we can utilize teaching and assessment strategies that promote more inclusive online spaces that are learner-centered and also support more inquiry or project-based instructional approaches. And the third recognizes that given our diverse classrooms, or the diverse classrooms that our candidates are in, the special attention that needs to be made towards underserved student groups that is students who have been placed in vulnerable situations, with the understanding that because we do have students that have suddenly been placed in perhaps more vulnerable situations, that we have to remember that we have to, as educators, check our own biases and think about how those biases impact the student learning experience. Now I'm going to talk about each of these three areas in more detail. So on the next slide, we'll start with the first area, which is a big area. It's a curriculum and lesson planning and the concept of culturally relevant and sustaining frameworks that many teacher candidates probably already learned in the credential program, hopefully learned in the credential program. At the center of that framework is the importance of establishing partnerships between teacher and student, so that students can feel safe and trust that like this learning partnership exists, and so that they're more likely to take risks when they learn. Now, developing like these partnerships might look different in an online space. Luckily, our candidates got some time to hopefully establish these partnerships, when they were teaching in person. But now that everything's online, they might have to reestablish these partnerships because they might look different, right? And a good way to think about this is a lot of the chatter that I've been hearing from educators around like, how do they monitor students to see if they're cheating? So cheating has become a big topic of conversation when we shifted to online instruction, and sort of this monitoring of, or this like being very cognizant about policing our students to see if they're actually cheating on assignments. And I think that if educators are just constantly worried about that, I think it will show and it will impact that level of trust that our students think that we have in them, causing them to trust us less, which then impacts, right, the way that the learning, that their learning might actually happen. Another good example of this is sort of this, the conversations I hear around educators who sort of label their students who don't participate, who might be quiet during a synchronous session or might not even join online sessions or not participate in the lesson. Educators labeling them as lazy instead of really thinking about the situations that they're in, right? So if that ends up happening, even if you don't outwardly show that you think that your students are being lazy, I think that by falling into that mindset, it will sort of at least superficially show through the way that you instruct and communicate with these students, which will of course impact their learning. So instead of doing that, I think that our candidates, all educators, should take the time to check in on their students to see how they're doing regularly. And also think about how they can establish those partnerships a little bit better. So, now that everyone's at home, and especially if our candidates are planning to do these synchronous meetings, I know Karen had talked about not having cameras on, but as a teacher, that doesn't mean that your camera has to be off. And I think that now that if your camera is on, if you're willing to show different parts of your home, so that your students can feel more connected to you, to see what your situation looks like, so that they can perhaps relate to your situation. I think that could possibly provide an opportunity for students to get to know you better and to feel closer to you. So it could possibly allow for these deeper connections to occur. It also means that under the culturally relevant and sustaining lens, that candidates have to make sure that they understand what motivates their students to learn with respect to their own cultural and social and life experiences, not what our candidates think motivates their students to learn. So in other words, assumptions shouldn't be made about our students and how they learn best or what motivates them to learn based on their, for example, ethnic or racial identity. Instead of making these assumptions, we have to remind our candidates that it's important that we first gather information about our students' backgrounds, what excites them and what engages them with respect to their cultural and social backgrounds, and then think about how we can then teach lessons that are anchored in that. Also think about the types of technology that our students are using and the types of technology that also motivates them to learn. For example, if you're teaching older students and you know that they utilize social media a lot, like Twitter and Facebook, and you want them to do some type of research project, why not encourage the use of Twitter or Facebook groups, for example, to gather research for anything that they might be working on, since Twitter and certain Facebook groups can provide those outlets, right? I would say most or a lot of the information that I get to remain up to date in what I do, I get from Twitter and I get from Facebook groups. So why not teach students how to use those sources if you know that they are already using that in the first place? Another area that's often discussed within the context of culturally relevant or sustained teaching is the importance of making sure that as educators, we think about how we can support both our communal and independent learners. I'm going to talk more about this later, but we have to think about what this actually looks like in an online space. How do we actually support our communal learners through a synchronous environment, for example, and does one or the other support communal learners better? For example, synchronous versus asynchronous approaches, or do synchronous approaches support more independent learning to occur? Those types of questions need to be thought about. The second area that relates to this is making sure that we've learned from people like Banks and Soniniero around multicultural education and how multicultural education can also impact the lessons that our candidates teach. So hopefully our candidates also learned about multicultural education and what that looks like, but what ends up happening is a lot of candidates think about quote unquote multicultural ed from a heroes and holidays approach, which I think initially is fine, which is means that we help them draw from their students' cultural and linguistic assets and celebrate their students' cultural backgrounds, which I think is great and I think is fine. But I also think it's important that, especially right now, as you know, like the pandemic is sort of magnifying inequality. So within the multicultural ed umbrella, I think it's important that our candidates also understand that their students are probably listening to the news, watching TV, or they're on social media, and they're thinking about how their own communities are being impacted by the pandemic. And so it's important to have these honest and truthful conversations about inequality and about matters of racism, discrimination, and social justice, and how those concepts continue to have a place in the lessons that they teach, especially now that these issues are magnified and more visible. Lastly, as we think about our students, we have to understand that they are culturally complex and understand that when we went to online learning, conversations about diversity, right, immediately shifted towards equity, I think. So in other words, like when we started going from in-person to online, all you heard about was, well, you know, some students don't have access to technology. And I think that that's super important and that definitely should be addressed. But all of the others of all the other areas of diversity sort of like were forgotten, right? And I think that it's important that now that that as our candidates are exploring the different lessons that they might teach, especially for the CalTPA, they think about the other areas of diversity that and identities that our students belong to. Students aren't just that come from low-income backgrounds aren't just students who come from low-income backgrounds. They also have these complex identities that should be thought about and addressed through the lessons that are taught. Now, in terms of the next slide, which is the teaching and assessment strategies that are part of the lessons that we're planning in a virtual setting. I'm going to talk about 3 different areas: inclusive online spaces, learner-centered teaching strategies, and inquiry-based instructional approaches. On the next slide, I'm going to highlight first inclusive online spaces. So I think and I want to talk about this first because I think I'm worried that sometimes students might associate and promote physical distancing, but also think that social distancing is part of that discussion. And I think that our candidates need to realize that sometimes virtual lessons can promote social learning to occur, and it gives their students a chance for students to socially connect, especially if it's through a synchronous platform. But can also happen through an asynchronous platform as well. And because some students might have less access to technology or be in vulnerable situations at home, teachers should also think about being flexible with the way that they interact, teach, and assess their students. So thinking about what the consequences, for example, if students don't participate or submit work late, I think that those matters of like due dates and things like that should be rethought because our candidates don't really understand the situations that our students are in. Karen already talked about how we need to help prepare our students for functioning in a digital learning environment and also practice what norms look like in a virtual space. So I want to just reiterate that and highlight that as also being important. But when participating in virtual lessons and thinking about access, I think it's also important that teachers need to think about access in terms of the speediness of internet that students have at home. That is high bandwidth versus low bandwidth technology. So I think the next slide sort of highlights that. So here we have on the upper version, on the upper part of that graphic, sorry, not version, graphic, are the types of virtual teaching strategies that work best when students have high bandwidth, when they have access to speedy internet at home. I think teachers can consider utilizing teaching strategies and incorporate things like pre-recorded video, pre-recorded audio, and asynchronous discussions that include video and audio, in addition to video conferences, audio conferences, live online meetings. But in addition to that, I think in order to be more inclusive, teachers need to think about the types of strategies that work with students who are in low bandwidth situations that might not have access to fast internet all the time. And when students are in situations like that, I think teachers should consider incorporating strategies that use things like just, for example, that utilize email, asynchronous discussion boards that might include text or images, or if teachers still want to include collaborative types of activities, supporting like Google Docs or other types of documents that allow collaborative learning to occur, or even like group chat and messaging. So I think in that access isn't just about whether or not students have access to certain types of technology at home. It also goes with the types of internet and the type of internet speed that students have access to at home too. We also have to remember that sometimes if there are multiple kids at home, there might be multiple people on the internet at the same time, which impacts the ways in which students can like watch videos and listen to audio or join an online session, right? So it might not even be that they don't have access to high-speed internet at home. It just might be that they might not have access to high-speed internet at certain times of the day. So that's important to consider. So the other two areas that fall under teaching and assessment strategies on the next slide, which include learner-centered strategies and inquiry-based instructional approaches, should also be considered. So similar to in-person class lessons, we know that like learner-centered strategies promote, rich and engaging learning experiences. But in online spaces, candidates should think about what these learner-centered activities look like. For example, how can our candidates help students demonstrate their learning through different types of format? Whether it be visually, or if students want to record themselves in a video using Flipgrid or draw something. Are candidates allowing for those various demonstrations of learning to occur? And when setting up collaborative learning environments in an online space, are there opportunities for them to do that through a synchronous environment by creating a breakout room in Zoom, or perhaps using shared documents, which we already talked about, using polling tools, or other tools like, for example, within Zoom that allows for like a thumbs up or a thumbs down, for agreement or disagreement, for like an informal assessment strategy. I think it's important also that teachers think about, that our candidates think about how they can support our students in becoming more independent learners. That is empowering them to learn on their own, since a lot of learning will occur on their own, right? Since they're not going to be in the physical classroom for as many, for any hours during the day. So as they think about that, how can they create structures that will allow students to learn on their own? How do they teach students to learn on their own and to be motivated to learn on their own? I think that that's also important. And when thinking about what works best when trying to engage and motivate students in online using inquiry or project-based learning, I think that our candidates should allow opportunities for students to develop their own lines of inquiry, create their own questioning, their own lines of questions, that is, so that they can then answer them on their own. And then from there, if our candidates help their students develop their own lines of questions as they think through a lesson, then all the teacher has to do is help their students develop research or teaching strategies that students can do on their own at home in a digital format, right? So kind of like I mentioned, teaching students how to use social media to gather research and use things like Google Scholar on their own, I think would also be important. And then the last area includes the way that we support students who come from underserved student populations, which comes on the next slide. So I'm realizing the situation that that the pandemic has caused students who come from these populations to sort of magnify the challenges that they might be experiencing. And it also magnifies, and realizing that it also magnifies a way that our candidates might be thinking about their students. And it could actually cause students, our candidates, to develop deeper biases towards certain groups because of just everything that's happening. I think that biases are something that people fall back on, right? When they're faced with multiple challenges in life, it's like you rely on what you already know, for example, which might include stereotypes that you have towards certain groups of people. So I think that it's important that our candidates sort of check themselves and think about how their biases might be impacting the students that they're working with. A good way to think about this is the idea of around like tech deficits. So I've heard a lot of educators say that because my students are like this, they don't do this. Because my students are, for example, low income or poor, they won't function well in an asynchronous space. Because my students are come from this type of environment, they don't have access to any devices. Like, sure, I think that that's definitely a possibility, but before we jump to those types of conclusions, I think that it's important that we understand what their actual situations are. So I'm gonna put in the chat box, here, hold on. I'll put it in the chat box right now. This is just an example of a student assessment, a student needs assessment that I think that I've seen teachers use or give to students, or perhaps let parents fill out, that highlights the types of access and the types of needs that students actually have at home, so that teachers can then, gather that information. So our candidates can then gather that information and then make decisions based on the actual situations that our students are in, instead of making assumptions about students that might not actually exist. I think that that's really important. We also have to help our candidates make sure that they understand the connections between race, gender, class, and sexuality, and understanding how the connections between those different areas impact student learning. So it's not just socioeconomic status and class and access that will impact their learning in a virtual space. It is still the things that matter with that element intersecting with race and gender and sexuality that can impact learning, and how can our candidates then plan lessons that take those connections into consideration. There's also this element of microaggressions that can occur in a virtual space that might not occur in an in-person setting. So discussion boards allow students, for example, to state their opinions or relate what's being learned in the class to like their own lives. That comes out more clearly in a message board discussion, right? In an asynchronous message board discussion. It can also come across through chats. Right now, we're at a place where Asian American students are heavily discriminated against, for example, because of the rhetoric that's coming out of the administration and other areas. And so I think that stopping microaggressions, or not even microaggressions, just straight up aggressions immediately is important, and monitoring for that. And having open and honest discussions about what these aggressions look like and how students might be displaying these types of aggressions in an online space is very important. I also think that in order to support our underserved students, we have to make sure that our candidates understand how to communicate with students and their families intentionally and exclusively, making sure that that our candidates understand how to support the language needs that many of our students and their families might come from, like that exists in the in-person classroom, but that communication is even more important in an online space. And making sure that our candidates understand how to utilize various modes of communication, whether it be through emails or through Class Dojo or other types of learning management systems, but also through something as simple as a phone call. On the next slide, I have some additional resources that relates to a lot of what I discussed that I think you guys can use if you want to, once you have access to the slideshow. But these are some great resources. But other than that, I'll see if I can I know that I wasn't monitoring the chat, but the next slide provides opportunities for questions. And if people want to share questions verbally, they can either raise their hand or just unmute their microphone and ask the question. But I'll also look at the chat right now to see what other people said, and I'll start addressing that too. So
I think Dan, you brought up some interesting points that I'm not sure, hopefully that school districts and teachers and teacher candidates are thinking through and working through some of the issues, realizing that parents are really becoming more, or need to be included more in the conversation of making sure that the environment that is set up for their students at home, that they're involved in that and how that sets up. And you talked about bandwidth and types of technology, that when it's, you know, class time and students are online, it may not be a good time for a person in another room to be streaming TV and somebody else doing FaceTime and somebody else in another room doing something, and everybody's sharing bandwidth, and then it becomes impossible for that student to do their work on the computer because the bandwidth drops down. So, you know, it sort of depends. There's just lots of variables there. But hopefully school districts and teachers are reaching out to parents, making sure that the workspaces that their students have set up at home are appropriate for, you know, online learning, if they do have the ability to do that. So that just raises a lot of issues, because, you know, parents are sort of used to dropping schools off, or their students off at school, and they go back to their lives, and it's the teacher's responsibility then to, you know, work with those students for, you know, during the time that they're in class. But it's sort of a shared responsibility when it's online, and the teachers are trying to interact with their students at home, making sure that, once again, that their students are in the right environment, that they're not being distracted. There's, you know, it's just all of those kinds of things come into place to try to set up a productive learning environments for the kids.
yes, I agree. Thanks, Wayne, for highlighting that. Are there questions, comments from anyone?
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, this is Karen. I was gonna say, Daniel and I are open to any questions you might have about anything we discussed. Happy to address further. So please let us know if there's anything that is of interest that you'd like to discuss further.
Yeah, this is excellent. I mean, the points that you, Karen and Daniel, have brought up really kind of take this to the next level, because when we first went to, let's go to online learning, the biggest question was, well, how do we do that? And it was all technology and access issues. And I think we've, you know, crossed that barrier a bit. So either students are in an environment where they do have access or they don't have the ability to do that, but you're seeing, wireless companies like Verizon and some of those other companies are coming into play and making sure that communities that do not have access or have not historically had access to, high bandwidth are, trying to make sure that those types of communities now have access to bandwidth. School districts are making sure that candidates have access to Chromebooks and other kinds of technology. So it's a long process here, but I think once we get past the technology connectivity issue, all the things that you've talked about today really come into play that really aren't that disconnected from how you do it face-to-face in a real classroom. We should be doing all this in our face-to-face classrooms anyway, but it just puts a real different spin on it. So it's good to have conversations about what this looks like in a virtual environment. So I appreciate you guys addressing it with that kind of spin on it.
Do you mind if I address Kelly's comment? And then Daniel, do you mind addressing Glenn's comment about assessing funds of knowledge? I wanted to address Kelly's comment though. And Kelly said that some students are having to navigate the learning environment for themselves. This is absolutely correct. They might not have a parent, guardian, family member at home to support them with this. Their parent, family, guardian might be out working. They might be one of the individuals on the front lines right now. And so there are a lot of learners who are navigating this for themselves. And so we can't make assumptions that they have a safe learning environment, that they have the supports they need. A lot of our learners are navigating this independently. And this is where the rapport, the reaching out, the support is necessary. It's also where the grace comes in. If an assignment is not submitted on time, who cares? Is the learning going to occur? It will at some point, but we have to offer that grace and find out what each of our learners need. And so I fully agree with your comment. I'm a parent. I have 2 kids at home, but even I can't control their learning environment. They're deciding what's best for them. They're teenagers, and so I have limited a voice, I want to say, in regards to how they would like to learn. But this is a very true statement, Kelly. Thank you for bringing that up. And Daniel, do you mind addressing the next one about assessing funds of knowledge?
Yeah, so when I see funds of knowledge, I think of 2 particular areas where funds of knowledge often come from. One is community resources, the other is family resources, right? So in terms of community resources, I think that if students understand or their families understand the types of resources that their community provides and how that can contribute to learning space, to the learning environment. For example, if communities provide support for certain families who might have less access to materials, food banks, things like that, I think it's important that students and families and even the educators understand the types of resources, like how to access those resources and how to help their students access those resources so that they can then be in a situation where they can learn best. But I also think that from like a family approach, I think that, or the home approach and the funds of knowledge that our students have that exist at home, I was thinking that the fact that students are stuck at home and they're probably at home with their family members, or I think that it gives them opportunities to also perhaps learn more from their parents and from their family and their background with respects to, like, for example, their own identity. So I started having regular, this is for myself, I started having regular Zoom meetings with my parents, because before I would, just talk to them on the phone every now and then. But ever since this happened, we started having regular Zoom meetings like every day or every other day. And through those Zoom meetings, I've learned a lot more about their background and about their experiences when they came to California from Thailand and some of the challenges that they faced when they first came here. But I wouldn't have known any of that if I wasn't put into this situation. And so I think that the situation that our students are in can allow them to actually learn more about themselves and about their students and about their families and about their communities. I think that there are opportunities for that. And then thinking about how all of that can impact learning, I think is important for our candidates to consider. Glenn, I hope that kind of addresses what you posted in the chat. I'm not sure if you want to talk about that, if that was your question, or.
I think part of that, just to dovetail on that a bit, is that, you know, we do make assumptions that, you know, parents and guardians and folks that are responsible for kids are themselves technologically literate and know how all this works. A lot of kids may be in families where they have tech skills way beyond what their parents or guardians may have. So it's an opportunity to, you know, open up the conversation and allow them to, you know, if they have the ability to do that, teach the other members of their family that may not have the tech skills, and help everybody, you know, raise the limit a bit so everybody has a more equitable ability to have access to technology and to be able to use all of this. Because as we've talked about before, using all this technology and the things that we've been talking about today, this isn't going away. As soon as they, you know, come up with a cure for COVID-19, we're not going to go back just to face-to-face teaching, and online teaching is just going to disappear into the night, and we're never going to use this again. I think that moving forward, teaching and just, you know, interacting is going to be more and more a combination of, when we get back to face-to-face learning, having an online component to it more than we've ever had before. So all these skills that we're developing now, I think is going to be sort of part of the blueprint of where we're headed in future for education.
Which I think also means a lot to credential programs, right? So if there are, so most of the people in this meeting are people who work at institutions of higher education and credential programs. And so when we look at the curriculum for our programs, I think we're going to have to start thinking about, in that classroom management class, like, in addition to thinking about classroom management in an in-person setting, we're now going to have modules around classroom management in online spaces, virtual spaces, and what that actually means.
Exactly. Good points. Well, Daniel and Karen, thank you so much. We are at the top of the hour, and we appreciate you coming along and sharing your expertise with us, and everybody that was part of the session here this morning. And we appreciate all your comments and questions, and thank you for being a part of this discussion. This particular session, as all of our sessions, are being recorded, and within the next couple of days it will be posted. The commission now, if you're not aware, has their own, we have our own YouTube channel, and all this will be posted on the YouTube channel. This PowerPoint will be posted on the commission website and be available to you, so you can come back to this. You know, when we do post online presentations on the YouTube channel, that's all well and good, but all the embedded links are not accessible. So we will also get that PowerPoint presentation to you, so you can take advantage of some of those links and some of those online resources that were presented in this presentation, so you can go back and take a look at those. So once again, thank you all very much for your time. We hope that you are continuing to do well in these changing times, and we will continue to keep you updated and posted as things continue to roll out and change. So once again, thank you for your time, and we will see you on the next one.